Good morning and good evening, and everyone. Welcome to the College of Liberal Arts and Social Science Advanced Method School. This is our second year, and we are very pleased to have Professor David Freedberg from the Columbia University to give us a talk on empathy and access in a digital world. I think digital humanity is probably getting more and more interesting, and we are happy to have David to share his thought with us. And we are also grateful for Professor Zhang Shuk Han, who is actually the chair professor of molecular medicine and also associate vice president of research at City University of Hong Kong, to give a welcoming remark to Professor Freedberg. So Professor Chang, yeah, please.
Okay, so good morning, everybody who's here and also on the Zoom. And then a very warm welcome to Professor Freedberg, Dean Walker, faculty, researchers, students, and guests. So it gives me very great pleasure to give a welcoming remark to this keynote speech of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences Advanced Method School. In this AI-driven era, we can witness a surging demand for data-driven research in all disciplines, especially in the studies of liberal arts, humanities, and social sciences. And research methodology has emerged as a very distinct subfield, encompassing computational methods, survey experience, digital humanities, and data sciences. So this is actually, a very good time for us to strengthen the interdisciplinary collaborations in humanities and the data sciences. Our College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences have taken this great, moment to organize the Class Advanced Method School. They call it the CAMS, aiming to serve as a platform to enable faculty and researchers to share the latest multi-methods research and training. And this Advanced Method School will no doubt foster interdisciplinary collaboration and translational academic exchange among scholars here and afar, and also with a particular focus on bridging the different disciplines. We also want, to hope that the other colleagues in the world to know more about the good work here at CityU too. In particular, we're very proud that we have the CityU strategic plan, which actually, with different disciplines all aligned to have interdisciplinary research clusters. And that for this, I'm very happy to see that in our the College of Science and Liberal Arts, we have research clusters covering One Health, Digital Society, Smart City, and Brain. And this is a demonstration of how this interdisciplinary our research is. Now, going back, coming back to this morning and this event today, I have learned that this is the second year for our college to organize these camps, and it is very exciting to have Professor David Freedberg here, the Pierre Matisse Professor of the History of Art and the Director of the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America of the Columbia University. He will give us, his keynote speech on empathy and access in a digital world. I trust that all of you will find Professor Freedberg's lecture very inspiring and love the beautiful images he's going to show us. And I wish everybody the best success in this Advanced Method School. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chang, for the very warm welcome and remark. And now I'll pass the floor to Professor Richard Walker.
Thank you, Ed. Dear Professor Freedberg, Professor Chang, fellow faculty members, students, guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, or in David's case, good evening. On behalf of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences here at CityU, I welcome you to this signature event of the Class Advanced Methods over Zoom, which has its advantages. The Advanced Method School is a branding initiative, as it were, that was launched in 2022 in response to a surging demand for interest in data-driven research in the realms of liberal arts, humanities, and social sciences. This is not to denigrate theory, of course. Theory is a central factor that drives us forward. But what we find, as Professor Cheng said, is methods are a great way to bring people together. from different disciplines, for people to share ideas and learn alternative and new ways to address the questions that they've long been interested in. So this is sort of the dynamic that we've been trying to create through the use of methods. We have 3 components within the school, emphasizing on research design, method training, and practical toolkits. So we have keynote speeches today by David Freedberg, a leading scholar on digital art and dialogue, which accommodates the different research aims and approaches in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. We run modules, which is methodology training workshops, so participants can comprehend advanced research design, methodological tools, and practical assessments, so they can carry out their own independent research, and seminars and publication seminars, sharing with journals, press, copy editors, and so forth, to allow people to convert their ideas into tangible research outputs. Last summer, we had 14 events organized. We had a keynote speech by Professor Pippa Norris of Harvard University. We had methods modules delivered by our Media and Communication Department, public policy and social and behavioral sciences, and seminars by the then Asian International Studies, Chinese and History, Media and Communication, and Linguistics and Translation, and also publication seminars. These attracted over 700 participants, both within the university, within the college, but also within the region and internationally. So I think we do manage to reach out to a range of people. This year we elevate that slightly. We have 16 events. So David's speech today, 4 methods modules and 8 seminars and 3 publication seminars, and these have run from April through June this year. And the speakers of these various events come from a variety of institutions: Tsinghua, Yonsei, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology here. And the module topics are wide-ranging: analysis of longitudinal data with multi-level models, quantitative text analysis, data analytics using R, an introduction to computational methods, etc. I would now like to give the floor to Professor Christine Huang, the Associate Dean for Faculty and Research in the college, and Christine will introduce our keynote speaker today. Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor Freedberg, Professor Chen, Dean, fellow faculty members, students, peers, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. Thank you, many thanks to Professor Chen's and the Dean's opening remarks. It is my great pleasure to be here to introduce to you about our keynote speaker, Professor David Freedberg. Professor Freedberg is Pierre Matisse Professor of the History of Art and also the director of the Italian Academy of Advanced Studies in America of the Columbia University. The Italian Academy is a premier global center for research in humanities and sciences. Founded in 1991 on the basis of agreement between Columbia University and the Republic of Italy, its chief commitment is to promote groundbreaking cross-cultural and cross-disciplinary work while addressing international social issues. After leaving South Africa at age 18, Professor Freedberg studies at Yale, Oxford, and also the Warburg Institute in London. He taught at Court Institute of University of London before joining Columbia University. And from 2015 to 2017, Professor Freedberg is also directed the Warburg Institute in London. Professor Warburg is best known for his works on psychological responses to art, and particularly for his studies on iconoclasm and censorship. He has written widely on the history of Dutch, French, and Italian art, and on the history of early modern science. He also has written books with contemporary artists such as Casas and Kentridge. Throughout his historical researches, Professor Freedberg has continued his work on responses to image of all kinds. His works in this area has been about neuroscience of empathy and motor and emotional and embodied responses. He retains his commitment to anthropological core of art history and hopes to return to a project on architecture and dance of Pueblo people, but is now making time to complete a trilogy on empathy and cross-cultural understanding of art. Today, Professor Freedberg will talk about empathy and access in a digital world and share his insight in art, neurosciences, and cultural conservation. In this lecture, Professor Freedberg will set up in accessible terms the ways in which strangers may begin to understand both masterpiece and ordinary images in our culture, and the ways in which we may understand the works of strangers. In doing so, he will consider the ways in which digital technology offer more or fewer possibility of understanding than traditional forms of making, modeling, and manufacturing. He will also examine how culturally specific knowledge built upon the basic forms of understanding that provides us with initial access to works of others. Thank you everyone again for joining this event. And I would like to give the floor to Professor Freedberg now. Thank you, Professor Freedberg.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang. I also want to thank Professors Cheng and Professor Cheng, both Professors Cheng, Shukhan, and Ed, and Professor Walker for their welcoming words this evening, or this evening for me and this morning for you. So I'm very touched that so many of you should have risen so early to listen to me, who will perhaps get sleepier as the evening goes, but with any luck, the context will make me rise to the challenge of the occasion. But it's a very, very great honor for me to be here this morning, to be woken up so early this morning to give you a lecture, to the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences here at the City University of Hong Kong and to the Advanced Methods School. So the basic thing I want to talk about this evening, as you will have gathered, is the accessibility of art across cultures. This is a slightly unfashionable approach these days. In the liberal universities of America, one of the most distinguished of which, Columbia University, I teach, would probably be dismayed and accuse me of being something which we used to think of as a compliment, but has now, strangely enough, in the United States, become a slightly derogatory term. In other words, I like to think of myself still as speaking in terms of the Enlightenment. I like to think that people are capable of brotherhood and sisterhood across the world. And this, I think, these days is regarded as rather optimistic. Nevertheless, I hope that this talk will cast some light on the possibilities that lie before us in this new digital world. Professor Wang did actually summarize or read my summary of my talk, so I'm not going to repeat it entirely, but let me begin by reiterating what many of you will have read already about the subject this evening. The subject is empathy and access in a digital world. It takes as its basis, I hope, a more rigorous and specific view of empathy than is common these days. As I wrote my lecture, I realized that I had less to say about the rigor and precision of my view of empathy, so perhaps we can return to it at the end if we are not too exhausted. But at any rate, my view of empathy is one that paves the way, I hope, for an understanding of cultural monuments across cultural, social, geographic, and linguistic borders. It's predicated on a neuroscientific theory of empathy that makes clear the basic accessibility of visual monuments of all kinds, even prior to specific cultural knowledges, whether textual or customary, social or regional. And so already Professor Wang made it clear to you that my interest was really in making sure that we still remain acquainted with the possibilities of cross-cultural understanding, that we don't return to the isolation of our individual regions and our individual cultures. There have been terrible misunderstandings, especially in the United States, but even across Europe, about the possibilities that lie before us here. The digital world makes it possible for us to communicate across boundaries. So when people say, if you speak only about your culture and your works of art, and those images which are canonical in your culture, you are somehow neglecting other cultures. I have insisted from the beginning of my teaching, perhaps because of my boyhood and youth and my first university years in South Africa, on exactly this, that there is no cultural artifact that is not possible to understand across the barriers that separate us geographically and culturally. So to some advanced thinkers these times, this may be regarded as heretical, but I hope to show that by bringing both the possibilities of digitization and acknowledging the fact that we share a common biology, however much change those affected those biologies may be by cultural circumstances, however much genetics may have become epigenetics, nevertheless, we still retain the basic possibilities of understanding. And I hope that this will come through this evening. So I'm going to begin with a really interesting and extravagant and controversial case, I think. Well, but before I get to that, I think I want to say that especially in the European and American universities, merely to talk of Western works, let alone canonical Western masterpieces, is said to be evidence of a neo-colonialist tendency. This is a position I reject, though of course I wholeheartedly acknowledge that to assume that the canonical masterpieces of one culture are also also to be regarded in this way in other cultures, or worse, are universally so, is problematic. No such assumptions should be made. In my talk today, almost all of my examples, I admit, will come from Western art, but I make no apology for this. I hope you will enjoy looking at them with me. But I also hope that you will realize that I'm going to be talking about my field of expertise, for better or for worse. And I use them to make my point, which is that works of art are basically accessible to viewers from other cultures as well, and may even also be regarded by strangers as masterpieces. In fact, for me to give a lecture with examples from other fields would indeed be arrogant, since I would certainly know less about them than those of my own. So my first hope would be that you can extrapolate the relevance of all my examples to any other lesser or greater works which you may choose, and that in the end your understanding of how we make judgments in works of art may be enhanced. So let me sum up this introduction, which has probably taken too long. For me, as a historian of art who has long believed in the potential contribution of cognitive neuroscience to the understanding of art and images, the two major issues of our time are: one, the accessibility of works of art to cultures other than our own, and two, the impact of digitization on our understanding and appreciation of art. In other words, the advent of techniques that enable the swift, permanent, and endless availability of the images of our world, whether they are what people call art or not. It would also be good to get to the question of how over-familiarity with images diminishes our appreciation of what is good or effective about them, but that perhaps should wait for another occasion. So on the one hand, we have more and more images with more and greater accessibility. On the other, we see the politicization of image use and the rise of resistance and control over who can see what. On the one hand, mass fetishization of canonical works of art, Vermeer, Leonardo, and so on. On the other, a sense that your canonization is not my canon. And at the extreme end of all this kind of thinking, the conclusion that my art in the end is mine, not yours. This may seem absurd, but consider the striking example with which I wish to begin. So now I'm going to begin sharing my screen with you. Let me. So I don't know, I wish I could see all of you, but I can't, sitting in the audience before me. But most of you probably don't know this, this image. This is a picture by an American woman artist called Dana Schutz.
David, we don't see your screen.
Oh, you can't see the screen?
Not at the
Whoops.
moment.
Okay, hang on. I thought I pressed share screen. Aha. Oh, goodness me. Okay, share screen. Thank you, Richard.
No problem.
Okay. Now let me, where are we? Dove siamo? Okay. So now you can see my screen. Great. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
The
Thank you.
delay. This often happens, of course. So here is a picture painted in 2017 by a young woman artist made for the Whitney Biennale of that year, 2017. The woman artist was called Dana Schutz. And it is a picture of a man. I can't see all of you, but how many of you know about this episode? Do you think, Richard, can I ask, do you think some people know about this episode? Ed, do some people know about this episode?
I guess within our audience, yes. I have to declare my ignorance.
Okay, good. So at least somebody is ignorant. I'm not going to waste my words by explaining. I think I saw Ed knows what it's about, but presumably the people who are not, you know, New York gallery goers do not know about it. It was a very controversial case painted by Dana Schutz. And this is a picture of Emmett Till, an American 14-year-old in 1955, who made the mistake of whistling at a white woman. And he was, that was regarded, of course, as being social with a white woman. So he was lynched and murdered, and his mother beaten up and brutally beaten up and murdered. And his mother insisted that he not be immediately buried, but he be shown to the public in his coffin, as often is the custom in the US. So the coffin was opened and the boy was seen lying there, horribly beaten. That was in 1955. And the mother wanted specifically to show, quote, what had been done to my boy. And, you know, it is interesting, of course, that from the beginning of time, all legal textbooks have insisted that we need visual evidence of the crime. So this call for compassion was consistent in a way with ancient legal theory. But of course, it was not approved of initially, but the picture was shown and the boy was shown, picture was taken, and then a picture made by photo was taken and the picture made from this by Dana Schutz in 2017. Let me just show you, oops, somehow I didn't, I had a beautiful photograph which seems to have gotten lost of a horrible photograph of this beaten up child. He's of course lying on his back here. You can't make out his face. The interesting thing, and in my view, the wrong thing that was done was an objection was raised by a certain group of the public saying that only blacks could convey the suffering of a black boy, and that it was disgraceful that the Whitney Museum had allowed a white woman to show this picture of a black martyr. And so the picture was taken down and the woman fell into disgrace. She fell into disgrace out of the best of motives. But this is where we are this is the point which we have reached in our time, in which art is supposed to be reserved for the cultures from which they spring. And the point I'm going to make is that is exactly the opposite. I mean, let me just say for a moment, I'm not saying that this is a really great work of art. That only time will tell. It seems to me rather a good work of art. was judged to be worthy of being put in the Whitney Biennial, which is a hugely competitive operation. But it was taken down, and the woman retired in disgrace, at least retired, left the field in disgrace for a few years. So what can we say about this at this point? I mean, I think that was completely the wrong decision on the part of the Whitney. I am very friendly with the director. I'm surprised that he succumbed to those kinds of pressures. But from the point of view, I'm not going to make a political talk this evening, although everything we do is political in one way or another. But what I do want to say is that the one thing you will all agree with me, whether you think it's a great work of art or not, is that it's an arresting image. You walk into the gallery, you notice the colors, you notice the distorted face, you stop there. You see immediately that he's wearing a jacket, he's got a shirt on, a white shirt, neatly pressed white shirt, but something is up with his face. It's been messed about with, that's all you can say, but it is pretty arresting. Once you've seen it, you stop. And that's a moment which I think we need all to consider. What is it about a work of art? What is it about any image that catches your attention in the first instance? So even though the picture was regarded as insulting, I am interested in what it is that makes you notice something in a work of art, what it is that makes you notice something in any image. And it's that point which is crucial for all of us. It's crucial because it makes you stop and think about what is going on. You can then choose not to investigate any further. But that's the beginning of everything that everybody looks at. That which grabs our attention. It may seem self-evident, but it's very important because the basic principle, which I've learned from neuroscience, is that while culture may inflect our reflexive responses, may adapt our reflexive and automatic responses, there's no doubt about that. We begin with something much more basic. We begin with our immediate and automatic responses, and this is the basic building block that joins us all. And so the principle that I'm going to be really underlines most of my work is this commitment to a rather simple belief, and most of you will have heard of this by now, that is the belief that, you know, we begin with our bottom-up responses. We begin with our immediate responses, and then these can be modulated top-down cognitively. And our cognitive responses are those which we learn from our cultural upbringings and so on. But we begin with access that, if you like, is universal. It depends on our biological responses to images, our fearful responses to images, our understanding of basic gestures like stop or opening our mouths in shock and horror. And then we can see what they mean to particular cultures or not, what those expressions signify. They are basic expressions such as those which Darwin already wrote about in the expression of the emotions in man and animals, which are universally recognizable, and there are other expressions which are local to cultures. But what I am really interested in are those bottom-up responses, and I'm going to be talking about this a little bit more. So with this in mind, let me move on. This is just my basic introduction, and I want to move on. Earlier this year, I was invited to speak at this, probably the most beautiful of the Palladian churches in Venice, designed by Andrea Palladio in the third quarter of the 16th century. And of course, it's those of you who have studied Venetian architecture, it's San Giorgio Maggiore, greater church of St. George, the great church of St. George in Venice. And I'm not going to say anything about the architecture. We can enjoy this. You are familiar in Hong Kong of the beauties of architecture on water. Venice, of course, is the place par excellence of beautiful architecture on beautiful bodies of water. But in the refectory of this church, I was invited to speak specifically about well, they wanted me to speak on actually a very closely related topic to the one I'm giving you today, but they were very, very interested in a particular challenge. And this challenge was posed by the fact that in 1563, the great Venetian painter Veronese was commissioned to do a painting for the refectory of this church. In other words, the dining room of the monks who lived in the abbey adjacent to this church. And that painting was stolen by Napoleon in 1797. And it's this picture. Now, you know, I'm going to spend some time at the end of my talk today suggesting why this painting, what catches your attention in this picture. But the problem that was posed for me was, this is the painting in the Louvre. And so the refectory was left empty. There was a big white wall until 2005 or 2008, actually. A big white wall at the end of the refectory where this painting had originally stood. So that it had been taken and by Napoleon and put in the Louvre, where it still remains today. But a company actually started in Britain called Factum Arte decided that they would use the latest techniques, digital techniques, to make a copy of this work and put it back, the copy, back in the refectory. So that's where it was supposed to be. And there is this perfect copy, this digital copy. So the question which I hope I'm going to be able to get into right at the end of my talk, if Ed Chang doesn't stop me before before I before I get to my conclusion, at the rate I'm going, I may not get to it, but we'll do our best. But so this, you walk into this great refectory, once a refectory, the dining hall of the monks, and there is what appears to be an absolutely perfect copy of Veronese's painting, which remains in the Louvre. So of course they wanted me to say, this is as good as the original or not as good as the original. And of course, the question was, with modern scanning techniques, how much of the original could be captured by this? This is not, to me, the central problem that I'm going to address this evening, but if we have time at the end, we'll get to it. But now I'm going to begin a long detour before we circle back to this picture. So some of you will recognize this etching by Francisco Goya, made from the famous Disasters of War series, the Desastres de la Guerra, done between 1810 and 1815. And it shows one of the members of the Spanish rebels trying to hack away at some French soldiers, and they're attacking them. Look at the brutal figure of the man with the hatchet. I'm not going to get into the historical details of this. This is one of the great printmakers, the master of gestures, Francisco Goya. And I think that you will all agree with me. I'm going to begin with subjective views and then we'll become more scientific. But I think you will all agree with me that you have a real sense in yourselves of this raising of the axe above the head. You then sort of, your attention thus grabbed. You also have a sense of this knife on the left-hand side that's about to be plunged into someone's back. And then, for example, you notice I can point with my, you notice the hand being stretched up in the middle. Those of you who've read some of my work will know the direction which I'm going. But before I get there, I want to say that I just want to ask you to think for a moment about the sense we have of our kinship with each of these gestures. It's not just that we are struck by these gestures, but it's almost as if we feel our arms lifting above our head or raised about to plunge that knife. It's an irresistible sense of emulation of the action in these pictures. Not too differently, one of the other images in the scenes of the Desastres de la Guerra. You see the old woman coming from behind with a knife about to stab the soldier who is attempting to rape the woman. And so again, we have a kind of embodied involvement with all the figures here. We have a sense of within ourselves of the raising of the knife on the right, the woman scratching her nails into the cheeks of the man in the fur hat, and the man in the soldier in the fur hat grabbing the woman to assault her. One can go on with this sense of embodied engagement with the subjects of a scene. Now, you know, all of you may, or many of you at least, will know of the works of Merleau-Ponty, the great French philosopher who spoke of exactly this the corporeal engagement of viewers with the movement they see in the picture. He set this out in his great book on the phenomenology of art. But you know, you'll all be familiar with this approach. You'll have felt it yourself. You know that people studied it. You all will have heard of Merleau-Ponty. Some of you may have heard of Robert Fischer, who already at the end of the 1860s wrote about the phenomenon of Einfühlung, feeling in, that you feel yourselves in the bodies of these others. And Einfühlung was the term that then became empathy in English. Feeling in, I mean, it's in Greek, means feeling in, and Einfühlung means feeling. We feel ourselves to be in the scene. And in fact, there was one great theorist of empathy between 1890 and 1910, Theodor Lipps, L-I-P-P-S, who wrote about exactly this. But he wrote also about feeling in of architecture when the architectural forms had some kind of biological element within them. Biological, what I mean by this is, look at this twisted column. He used this twisted, what's called Solomonic column, as an instance of feeling in of even of something as seemingly stable as architecture. And it is true that when you look at this column at the entrance of San Pietro in Bologna, which is the parish church of the Italian town of Bologna, you do have this slight sense of torsion within your own body. I mean, some of you will say you don't, but I think most people who go in there have this slight feeling of curvature within their own bodies, and sometimes they actually act this way. And actually, who could not empathize, as one would say, with that poor man right at the bottom of the column, this figure who seems to be trying to hold up the weight of this column. So this too became a kind of phenomenological obsession, the feeling of the notion of Einfühlung, this notion that somehow our bodies are engaged with what we see. Now, the other person I want to mention now is the great art historian A.B. Warburg. As you know, I studied at and later became the director of the institute that bears his name. And he took the understanding of images in a slightly different direction. And he wrote his dissertation on Botticelli. Here is the famous Primavera by Botticelli. I'm not going to tell you about the thousands of theories that have been devoted to Primavera as spring. This is the goddess of spring. There's Flora on his right and various other goddesses, the three graces just to the right of Mercury on the far left. So it's a very, let us say, a classical painting in Western terms. I mean, it's a painting which is based on Greco-Roman mythology, and it has been the subject of 1,000 books. But what interested, we're not going to talk about the possible subject of this lovely scene in a wooded grove. And what Warburg was interested in was this group, especially of the three graces on the right, these dancing figures here. And what he wanted to point out was that these delicate draperies around their bodies, which barely covered their skin, but fluttered in the breeze, as you can see here, gave a sense of their, he claimed, I'm not saying you have to agree with this, I'm not sure I agree, but he was very interested in the fact that this gave a sense of the inward feelings of these figures. Now, when you look at Botticelli now, you say, well, there's not much in the way of feelings here, but he said these fluttering drapes are mentioned by many poets. You can just see the movements of the body within the fluttering drapes, and many of these types came from these curving figures, gracefully curving figures, whose forms were barely covered by these drapes, derived from these ancient reliefs of the Maenads. And the Maenads were the followers of drunken Bacchus. So here you see them dancing a little more wildly. And Warburg was very interested in the relationship between emotion and movement, and emotion and the ways in which the movement of the bodies could be emphasized by these fluttering drapes. You can go through all of Renaissance art and you will see thousands of examples. These are classical reliefs from 350 BC and before the birth of Christ. And so they go a long way back. And he said that he insisted that these, look at these drapes, conveyed some of the drunken excitement of the movements of their bodies. So you may think, oh, well, drunken excitement. But if you go further in Western art, look at that. This is a figure with fluttering drapes, a sculpted figure of one of the sisters of the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, at the entombment of Christ. And I think no one could doubt here the intense emotional expression of this figure, this high distress, because they actually were shown, this is one of the figures surrounding the dead body of Christ, which I'm not showing you here because it's a long kind of tableau with many terracotta sculptures, just more than life-size, in the Church of Santa Maria della Vita in Bologna. And so here was, as it were, this is from the 1480s, and this is an instance of what Warburg would have called the pathos formula, one of the formula for representing high drama, high pathos in a scene of emotional distress. And all this is conveyed by the movements of the body and the drapes that fly behind them. This is one of the most terrifying and beautiful figures in the history of Renaissance art. And so if we look at Caravaggio, we move away from just the expression of emotions by drapes, but the expression of emotions by gestures. And you see here, it's the Caravaggio, the body of Christ being placed in the tomb, and you can see the woman raising her hands above her head as a way of showing her extreme grief at the sight of the dead body of Christ being put in the tomb. This is what Warburg called a pathos formula, a formula for the expression of pathos. Pathos formulae, I just want to add here, have always been interpreted by scholars, partly because of Warburg's own interests in this interpretation. They've always been interpreted in terms of, well, Caravaggio saw an ancient Maenad, or he saw something else, and then later on Goya saw these gestures, and so it was a matter of the afterlife of antiquity. I think this is completely wrong. I think that this expression of distress, which is universally recognizable, is an entirely biological form of biological release, and it's this biological dimension which characterizes the pathos formula. And so the pathos formulae are not restricted to one culture or another, but are recognized universally. When you are seeing something in shock, you raise your hands. When you want someone to, well, that's not so much a pathos formula. You cry out loud and so on. We'll come to some other expressions, some other examples of the use of pathos formulae. But let's look at some more. Here's another famous Western painting from around 1305, between 1305 and 10. This is a painting by Giotto. Again, you see not hands raised above the head, but John the Evangelist instead of showing having his hands behind him, also in distress. But what I'd like you to do is to look at the angels above the scene, which contain an almost entire repertoire of formulaic expressions of distress. Look at the little angel on the lower left side. We recognize this gesture immediately. Look at the clenching of the fists and the arms stiffened right in the middle. These are really common to all cultures. Look, also pressing to, well, I said pressing to the cheeks here. This is interesting, the wiping of tears from the eyes or covering the eyes in shock at the scene. The pressing here of the hands together and putting it the side of the cheek. We don't need to say that this is an expression which is used in Vietnam only or in Polynesia only. We can tell whatever this expression is. We don't know anything about angels. We don't know anything about the story of Jesus, but we can see what they are suffering. Same here. Here's someone who is very distressed and upset and crossing their hands across their chest. Here is the putting of the hand again on the eye to wipe away a tear, and a further sign of distress. Both these beautiful sculptures were made around 1400 by the French sculptor or French Franco-Flemish sculptor Klaus Sluter. You can find it on the so-called Well of Moses in the French town of Dijon. But look at this. One of the points which I've always made about these pathos formulae is when you do this, in shock and horror, when you cover your eyes, it's not only because you don't want to see the scene, but because you need to wipe away the tears. And the artist is amazing. I don't know how well you can see because he's painted the most beautiful tears there and there. And here, this is one of Mary's relatives and at the scene of the death of Christ. And here is Mary, the mother of God, here also with one of these spectacularly painted tears. So I show you the whole painting. I've written quite a lot about this, so some of you may know my views on all this already, but this is a great painting of 1435. It comes from my old colleague Astrid Hart, who is teaching with you at City University at Hong Kong, knows this painting very well, so I put it also there for her, and she's probably taught you about it as well. But so here is Christ descending from the cross. You see there one of the Marys pressing the kerchief to her eyes. You see the Magdalene here in shock, pressing her hands together. But I think what is interesting about well, there's several interesting things. There's the collapse of the Virgin, about which I've written a lot, beautifully painted Virgin. And we know that people are upset right away. First of all, the Virgin slumps to the ground. Usually she's shown standing. Here she's slumping to the ground. Don't you have a feeling in yourself of some internal collapse of the body? You have a sense of how she has crumbled to the ground. You have a sense, when I say a sense, I mean a sensory sense. You feel this in your own body. You recognize the sorrow of John the Evangelist. Again, beautifully painted tear, but you can tell from the wrinkling of the forehead of John the Evangelist and Nicodemus, one of the people who took Christ down from the cross. You can read the emotions in their faces. These are not expressions of happiness. These are people who are grievously sad. It takes no intelligence, no cognitive knowledge. You don't need to have a handbook of emotion to understand their distress. Here, again, the two weeping virgins. And here's the picture again. So, you know, I've already made a claim. We know, because Astrid is in the audience, I won't repeat the long discussions of this picture, but this is a feeling not of the passion of Christ, but the compassion, the empathy that the people within the scene have for Christ. And it's a physical feeling. Empathy has to do with movement and actual movement of the body. Here, the Virgin is showing her feelings of compassion for her suffering of her son by the fact that she declines, she slumps to the ground in exactly the same way her son is slumping off the cross. And we feel this within ourselves. Spectators feel this within themselves. You don't have to know a thing about the crucifixion of Christ. You don't have to be a Christian to get the basic story here. So this brings me, of course, to some of my own neuroscientific work. I was very excited already at the late 1990s by the discovery of mirror neurons by a group of scientists in Parma. And the mirror, so I've written a lot about this, and some of you may know my writings on the subject, some of you may not. But I show you a monkey brain on the top left and a human brain on the bottom right. And they were working with monkeys, a group of scientists under Giacomo Rizzolatti in Parma. And what they found was here in area F5, which is in the premotor, oops, how do I get these? No, I'm trying to get my pictures here to go to the side. Let's see if I can do that. Well, oh, how did that happen? Whoops. No, we've lost something here. Okay, but I'm just trying to move the pictures here out of the way so I can see these images on my own screen. Okay, good. So here is a monkey brain. They discovered that there were neurons in this area, the area of the premotor cortex, more or less there, and the inferior parietal cortex there. This is the prefrontal area of the brain. This is occipital cortex of the brain in the monkey, and this is a human brain. And what the scientists in Parma found was that the neurons in this area of the premotor cortex and this area of the parietal lobe, they were activated not only when they executed an action, but when they saw an action being executed. So in other words, the same parts of the motor cortex were activated by the viewers of a scene as would be activated if they were actually engaging in that action themselves. And this seemed to me a remarkable discovery. In the sense that this explained to me, it seemed to me, the ways in which we feel ourselves engaging in the actions we see. And, you know, often people actually act out this. They say, don't you see that the person who's doing this? Or you sometimes find yourself actually copying, sometimes you don't. But the activation of motor cortex, the activation of that part of your motor cortex or your premotor cortex that would be activated if you actually executed an action yourself, doesn't mean that you actually are doing it, but that your motor cortex nevertheless is activated as if you were doing it yourself. And this seems to me to go a long way to explaining why it is that we have in ourselves a feeling of emulation, of imitation, of bodily imitation of the actions we see in a picture. And so this you can see here, actually it's very interesting. Here, area F5, which is Brodmann's 44, that's the technical term for this area of the brain, Brodmann's 44 and 45, corresponds with Broca's area, by the way, which is also related to language. But these neurons here are activated in the same areas of the human brain. It was later discovered as well. And also here in this part 4, Brodmann's 40, which is the inferior parietal lobule. And there are other areas here in the center of the brain, also up here, which we don't need to go into. But the principle of mirror neurons was that they fired, as I say, in viewers' brain exactly as they would fire if they were engaged in actions that the viewing monkey or human being saw. And this seemed to me to, why is it not happening? Oops. Okay. This seemed to me to explain why, when you look, here's a preparatory drawing by Goya with the same action, the raising of the axe. You have a sense of raising your own hands in that way. Same with the print we just saw. Same with a painting. It's interesting how Goya returned over and over again. He knew the meanings of specific gestures. Same with these angels. We now understand why we have a sense of these gestures ourselves, and that would also help explain our emotional understanding of a scene. These are all actions, interesting, these are all actions which have huge emotional dimensions, but I return to this picture of the Mary on the painting by Roger van der Weyden of the late 1430s, once in Louvain in Belgium, now of course in the Prado in Madrid, so beautifully painted, that when you do this, people understand it straight away, not because it's necessarily an obvious sign of grief, but because when you're sad, you have to wipe your eyes. I also now turn to another aspect of the mirror discoveries, because what was later found, look at this. This is the picture of the wound of Christ. You see this wound in his hand and you start back. You're kind of shocked. You have a sense of a gash actually in your hand or somewhere in your body. Here is the gash in Christ's feet. It's very dramatic. That's where the nails went through. You don't need to know that someone stuck nails in his hand, but you certainly have a shock, whether you have a shock in your foot or not. But we do know now that neurons in the somatosensory cortex, in the particular part of the somatosensory cortex of the brain that you see would be activated if you had this wound, is activated in yourself as well. And there's some dramatic, I mean, this is really quite striking. There's Christ's hand next to his mother's hand. You see how one is imitating the other. And this is the true meaning of Einfühlung. You are feeling in yourself what the person you are seeing is suffering, herself or himself. Look at that. This, of course, is a detail of the crucifixion by Grunewald, the famous German painting, now in Isenheim in Alsace in France, but you have a real sense of the banging of the nail through. I like showing this painting by Caravaggio, which is the incredulity of St. Thomas, when he didn't believe that the wounds on Christ's side were real. And so Christ said, "Give me your hand." And he stuck it in his side and he said, "Oh my God, this is a real wound." Huh? But there are few paintings, I think, which give you a sense of that finger being thrust into the flesh of another body. And I think you also, once you notice that, you also have a sense of the way in which Christ grasps the wrist of St. Thomas and guides it into his side. So you may say, "Boof." Well, you may be skeptical, and you may say to yourselves, well, it's all very well you're saying this, but how is it that I feel this in myself? How do we know that I'm consciously aware? That's a good question of these feelings. All this neural activity may be going on, but it doesn't mean that I'm actually consciously aware of it. That's a big problem, of course, related to the whole problem of consciousness, which we cannot begin to go into this evening. But I have always been very impressed by the work of V.S. Ramachandran, who was one of the pioneer researchers, not the pioneering researcher, but a pioneering researcher, not only on phantom limbs, in other words, on limbs which you feel are there, even though you have lost them. In other words, he did research on people who had their limbs amputated. And as you know, people who have their one limb amputated often have a sense of feeling in the limb that is gone. And or deafferented limbs, as they say. That's a phantom limb. When you have you lose a leg or you lose an arm and you still feel that it is there. You know, what he showed was that you could touch the cheek of someone with a phantom limb and they would have a feeling in the phantom arm. And that's because the zone in the sensory cortex of the brain that feels touch on the face is adjacent to a zone related to the movement of the hand. And because the hand wasn't there when you stroked this, you also had a feeling in the area that was related, that was responsible for feelings in the hand. So that's one aspect of phantom limbs which interested me. But more interesting to me was an extraordinary experiment which Ramachandran devised to help relieve phantom pain in the lost limb. What happens with phantom limb patients very often is because of the lack of use of that limb, but the messages that still get sent to the brain and that parts of the brain that control the lost limb are activated, seem to cause a terrible pain. And so what he did, Ramachandran, who was a vision scientist to begin with, devised this box. Many of you probably know this experiment, which has deservedly become famous. And so he had the phantom patient put the actual hand in this side of a box, and then he put a mirror here. This is a mirror. And when the patient who was suffering from the phantom pain saw the hand reflected in the mirror, this is just a reflection of the hand, the patient thought that the limb was regained and the phantom pain disappeared. In 90% of the cases, the phantom pain disappeared. Not only with arms, but here you see a man who lost a leg, and this is his real leg. Here's a mirror, and when he sees the leg in the mirror, the phantom pain disappears. This is an incredibly moving phenomenon, but to me, what interested me was it went some way to accounting for the ability that we have via sight to have consciousness of a body part that is not our own. And I could give you many other examples of this kind. We'll skip these drawings of the brain. I want to tell you about one other experiment which I've made, because I realized that, how much time do I have, Ed? I can't hear you.
Around 15 minutes, I would say.
Okay. Give me 15
you can
minutes.
go.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Here's an experiment which I conducted with another neuroscientist. I was always interested in what happens when we see dancing figures, because you know, so much research on empathy has been done on sad subjects, and actually most research on negative emotion has been done on fear. We know a lot about fear responses, and I may come back to those briefly. So I went to my friend Fortunato Battaglia, a neuroscientist, said, I want to see what happens in my brain when I see other people dancing, because usually when you see other people dancing, you kind of feel happy. I think it's because, you know, people's bodies seem light, they detach from the earth or whatever. Of course, not all dancing is detached from the earth, but that was kind of primitive theory which I had. And he looked at me, he said, you're crazy. We cannot do experiments like that because dancing involves too many limbs to test at once. He said, just pick one action and we'll see whether when you see that action, your motor cortex is activated. So I immediately, for some reason, thought of this action, the raising of the wrist. And I thought of one of the central scenes by Michelangelo in the Sistine Ceiling, which is the hand of Adam raised like this, you see, to keep off the angel who is expelling him and Eve from paradise for having eaten of the apple of paradise. Here it is. So what we did was, what you can do is you can stimulate using TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. You can stimulate the part of the brain that would cause you to raise your hand, just to begin to raise your hand slightly. In other words, you discover the motor threshold, the minimum amount of current necessary to make you raise your wrist slightly. So we did this. We got subjects. We made them just look at a blank screen. We found their motor threshold, the minimum amount of current needed to raise the hand like this. And then we showed them this painting. And what we found was that the mere sight of this painting required less current to activate the raising of the wrist than it would have if they'd just been looking at a blank screen. So we here, oh no, this, skip, I'm not ready to get there. So that was really conclusive. Then we thought that, well, maybe we should see what difference Michelangelo made. So we got, actually, Battaglia himself had himself photographed doing as close as possible an approximation of Adam's gesture. And so we, again, found the motor threshold for the raising of the wrist by using TMS, magnetic current applied to the top of the head. So you trained neuroscientists can actually stimulate premotor cortex quite specifically without necessarily knowing where to place the coil of the machine, of the stimulator. And we found that it required less current to activate that wrist when they were looking at the photograph of someone imitating that, and even less current watching Michelangelo. So here is Fortunato doing his best emulation of the wrist, and you can see that just looking at the photograph, if you look at the photograph of the hand, the motor excitation is much less than it is in the painting. So this is a synonym for what I've just said. Motor excitation is greater by looking at the picture than looking at the photograph, than just looking at a bare screen. So that seemed to me very conclusive. And then one of the first referees of the article said, oh, well, the only reason you have this extra excitation is because it's such an emotional scene in the Michelangelo. So we showed them a relaxed wrist in a painting also of Christ suffering here. And we found that the motor excitation dropped. In other words, we had to get the same motor potential going, you actually required even more current with the dropped hand. So our initial hypothesis was perfectly clear. And so this really, I think, all this evidence combines to show us why we have this sense of imitating gestures. And because I was in Venice, I'm going to try and get to Venice again now quickly in my last 10 minutes. It gives you a sense of why you understand this great painting by Titian. Even the Virgin going up to heaven, you want to raise your hands. You notice the raising of the hands of the apostles. You again have a sense of raising your left hand. Actually, I'm very interested in the fact that when you see figures from behind, you often have an even greater feeling of involvement, perhaps because it's easier to get bodily involved with them than if you see a figure looking out at you, confronting from the front. But that's a theory of mine, which I haven't tested yet. I'm just going back to the twisted column. Now look at this twisted column. If you can have a feeling of empathy, of bodily engagement, of motoric engagement with a piece of architecture, now look at the body. I want to show you something interesting here, because this tells us something about art. I'm going back to the church, which I showed you, the beautiful church, which has that painting of the marriage of Cana in its refectory. This is a picture of St. George, not a picture, sculpture of St. George. It's really a boring work of art. But when you look at St. George across the way in the palace of Prince Cini in Venice, this is by a painter called Ercole dei Roberti of around 1475, you really have a feeling of inner torsion This is just because the painter is better at conveying the twistedness of the body than this miserable sculptor. Same subject, better done. And then, look at this picture, also by Ercole dei Roberti. You have a sense of engagement because of the torsion of the body, but then you also notice how thin this poor figure of John the Baptist is. And look at this painting here by a great painting by Antonello da Messina, about around 1480, 5 years later. We identify with these twisted bodies, tied to these twisted trees, emaciated, their mouths up to the heavens. This is what, this is the real meaning of empathy, when you feel physically involved. And you don't even need to have, shall we say, these limbs yourself, because those parts of the brain that would be activated if you had those limbs are still there. And this is actually one of the hopes I have for possibility of therapy in the future. But that's a whole other story. We identify physically with this naked figure. This is one of the bad thieves. You don't need to know this, but you see this picture and you get it straight away. This is the sinner who was crucified alongside with Christ. You can see the pain, you can feel the awkwardness of their posture. Down the road from the church where the Virgin carried up to heaven, I just showed you, the Assunta Baptician, are two paintings by Tiepolo 100 years later. We have a sense of this whip being raised, or the stick being raised to hit Christ, and also of the weight of the cross, perhaps even more. Christ is stumbling under the cross. It's our bodily involvement with these scenes which is so important. I just want to say one other gesture which we find very often. The mirror theorists also discovered what is called buccal from the bocca, the buccal, the mouth movements. They discovered that we also have a sense in ourselves of the opening of the mouth in fright or in terror. This, of course, is Caravaggio's Medusa of 1597. And look at this expression of pain. We identify with these figures immediately. This back to 1475. Carlo Crivelli, a Venetian painter. This is distress, these angels supporting Christ. We understand their distress, we stop. And then we may learn what is the story behind this. But the basic message we get and the basic quality of the art and those elements that lead to judgment of quality emerge from our physical involvement with these scenes. I love this painting so much also by Antonello, the mouth half open, the wound splashing from out, the blood splashing out from the side, the sad expression of the angel. One is immediately engaged with these figures. Now you may think, this is perfect naturalistic painting. You may think that this only applies to perfect naturalistic painting, but if you invite me next year or the year after or the year after, I will tell you about the possibility of empathic feelings, even for abstract figures. So it's not totally predicated on naturalism. And this brings me back to, quickly, I'm just going to conclude, a lot more to say. When you go into the refectory, it looks too busy, but then you notice certain parts. And the first thing that grabbed your attention, again, there's the twisted body. You identify physically with this figure. You notice the strumming of the guitar, of the, not the strumming of the guitar, this viol, this cross between a viol and a cello, the viol, the 16th century thing. And you have a sense in your own fingers. And we have done experiments on the activation of finger involvement with the practice of these musicians. And look here, again, another twisted figure. We see them straight away. This is what brings us into the picture. What another factor which is important is the outward gaze. We see this woman looking at us. It's almost an invitation to be in the picture. And interestingly enough, the Council of Trent, that severe council, which felt that this painting was too frivolous for a church because there was too much food on the table and too many well-dressed people. And they said there's even a woman picking her teeth, but Veronese with a toothpick. Veronese knew what he was doing. because he knew how to get your attention. And once you're in there, you can figure out the colors, you can do whatever else you want to in the realm of judgment. So again, I have to talk to you about judgment on another occasion. And I'm just going to show you, finally, here's the picture as it is made by Factum Arte. And so the question, which will be for the 5th lecture I've offered to give you in the future, or whatever it is, you don't see any difference. It doesn't matter. I mean, the digital picture brings you into the scene. The digital picture will engage you just as all those details do. But what is the difference? It's very interesting that I just saw the question here really is the materiality of the aura of the painting. What is the materiality of the general impression it makes? And that really is something which one has to consider, because the people who made this image are using not only scanning it and using ordinary reproductive techniques, but they're using 3D laser scanning. So they actually have the tactility of the paint. You can't see this on the screen. But when you get there, it looks, I went and I looked and I saw it's got the crumbly paint. It's got the thickly painted areas. And it's all there. You have this multimodality in which vision translates into touch. How often have we looked at pictures and we have a sense at our fingertips that we are touching a thing? So the whole issue of multimodality arises, actually, in my opinion, we are going to come to a twofold conclusion. The first is that it's very clear that to involve people in images such as this, simpler or more complex ones, once you are attracted by these twisted figures at the side up there, the woman looking out, the woman with a toothpick somewhere back here, the viol strumming person. Once you're attracted, you're in, you get to figure out, you want to know what's happening. You have top-down modulation and bottom-up responses, but you are there. This picture will do just as well. But when it comes to judging the quality of the work, I still think that we are able to distinguish. And just as I think that AI will never replace human intelligence, so I think that reproductive digital technologies will never replace the sheer manuality of individual human, often mistaken forms of attempts at reproducing reality. The mistakes that they make will never be incorporated by AI because AI may be too intelligent. So the plus is, it serves to bring people in. The other plus, I suppose, rather than a negative, is that these advanced digital techniques will never substitute for the human hand. And so that's my conclusion this evening. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm open to questions.
Thanks a lot, David. For giving us such a engaging talk, and well, I would probably say, before hearing your conclusion, I would say I probably want to go to Venus, but probably, well, we can still go to Google, and the digital, technique somehow helps. And it's really fascinating that you tell us more about how this kind of image and architect are somehow entangled with our bodies and psychological responses. Yeah. And I think most important is that you used different kind of experiments and stimulations that you can really trace about how human people from different parts of the world can appreciate, or as you said, identified with this great piece of work and art, although it produced in different times and space or different cultures. And I think those are really fascinating. And so I would now open the floor for questions and discussions. And any people would like to raise some questions to Professor Freedberg, please. Maybe when people are thinking, let me start with the question first, because at the end you talk about aura. which of course, I mean, I still remember when I read this term in some sort of critique when Benjamin raised this term at the very beginning, right? He was thinking about how these mechanical reproductions will somehow influence our sense of authenticities and things. And I was wondering, what's your take? I sense a little bit of your take on this, but he was then pushed forward to about talking about the arts and the mechanical reproduction in movie, on which you really cannot be on the system treble to feel that kind of thing and then look at the so-called authentic picture. But how in your study and also the transformation of the digital world, do you think whether or not you have a new answer or respond to his understanding of aura or the way that we see art production in the digital worlds? Yeah, thanks.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and the world is divided, as you know, between the humanists and the scientists, because the humanists actually began with Benjamin looking as aura as a kind of a bourgeois thing. They thought that if a work of art had this aura of authenticity, it was somehow associated with ritual. And, of course, the beginnings of art, you could say, and certainly the art I've shown you has some kind of fundamental connection with religious ritual. And so Benjamin, who of course, was a serious communist for most of his life, thought that the aura was somehow really elitist, enough aura. But I have written other articles written a lot about the aura of visual representation more generally. And all representation has some kind of aura. So, and I don't, I have never I'm a huge admirer of Walter Benjamin, huge admirer, but I think aura, he wasn't quite right about aura. And I think that he himself actually right at the end also admitted that, non-unique things could have aura. He was, of course, very interested, as you rightly say, in the cinema and so on. And he felt that the cinema was, as it were, the end of aura. But that's, I think he realized that he was himself not entirely consistent. So the whole Benjamin, keeps on popping up. I wish I could say something about that, but I won't. Let me get back. Yeah. Am I still on? Shall I stop sharing?
See your picture. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
We can share again if necessary.
Okay,
so.
thank you. So yeah, Doctor, we have two more questions. I think it's Ostrich. You raise the hand first, and then we will go to Richard first, please.
Yeah, hi David, first of all. Nice seeing you. And talk and
Nice
sharing.
To see you again. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful early Netherlandish painting. So I want to ask a question actually where you finished your talk. So it was very interesting, your focus on different gestures and how it engaged the viewer, well, how it triggers empathy with us viewers. But I wondered if you have some thoughts about what's the role of technical virtuosity of these masters within this relationship that they establish with the viewers, the empathy they trigger with us viewers. So do you have some thoughts about what the role of their technical skills can be with that? Because what I saw of your the results of the research you did with Michelangelo, the raised hand, you saw a difference in response between just a picture of somebody raising his hand and the actual painting by, well, the very skillful like Michelangelo. So I wonder if you have thought about that already, if you can share your thoughts about that, what the role of skill will be in all of this.
Well, look, I think that in a way I implied my answer to this, and certainly I've thought a huge amount about it. So the role of technical skills, I think, is fundamental, and that was the real point of my conclusion, because it's not clear to me that either digital, that digital reproduction or AI are ever going to be able to, really substitute for human technical skills. And actually, in the case of the the Michelangelo case is really interesting, because Michelangelo's hand actually showed a greater motor evoked MEP, motor evoked potential, than this very good human imitator. Why? We have to discover yet, maybe just by showing, a bit Michelangelo, more bulgy muscles. But then you who know Flemish art, Martin van Heemskerk or Cornelius van Haarlem don't make you feel any more, motorically inclined. So I think artistic skill is really, really, really critical. When I wrote The Power of Images, I was sort of much more interested in the similarities between ordinary images and great images. And now I'm convinced, despite all my democratic impulses, I'm convinced that, some works are greater than others, and actually that people can tell that they're greater than others. And that is, of course, because of the technical expertise, the technical masteries. So that is why this whole thing, the aura of materiality, if you like, which was the title of a book about that copy in San Giorgio Maggiore, I go in and I look at it, and it's amazing. I thought this is going to be a flat picture when you look at the reproduction of the Veronese. But you go there, and I'm telling you, those of you who never look closely at paintings don't know, you can actually stick your nose into a painting. I tell my students, stick your nose, and you can see the creamy paint, or one of the things that I suggest to those of you who are not art historians, I can't see you all. I know Astrid is an art historian, I don't know how many others there are. But, I had to go to the Frick Museum in New York has reinstalled its pictures in the most horrible modern building. And one of my old students is a curator there, and she said, a prize to someone who can tell me which painting in this room has never been lined. Now, you may think, you will know, Astrid, what I'm meaning by this. You may think, what is this about? Because when the canvas of a painting degenerates, the painting is usually relined. In other words, it gets a new canvas support, but in order to make it stick to the other thing, they iron over it. And so the painting loses a lot of the granularity of the surface of the paint. But most people can't see this, but that's only because they're not trained. Because actually, if you've been made to look, and fortunately I passed the test, I said that picture there by Manet is the one which has never been lined. But you, the rest of you, have not looked carefully, would never be able to tell. But you really can see the millimeter differences in a paint surface. In other words, in one which has been left on its own, as opposed to one which has just been flattened by a delicate ironing to make it adhere to its backing. So I think this, but the interesting thing with this Factum Arte reproduction is that, and that I can't explain, that, you and I, Astrid, need to make this trip together, or we need to conduct an experiment, because you and I will be able to say, nah, this is a reproduction. But in what ways? How can we really describe this difference? Because they've been using 3D laser reproduction. I mean, I can tell you the story of well, no, this is a whole other story. So, but there are two issues here. One, can we tell always whether it's a reproduction just by the apparent tactility? No. because now they're making tactile surfaces. We still think we can tell, but we don't know what it is actually that is happening there. But I think most trained people can see the difference even between a computer-generated image using 3D technologies and one that is not. And so that, you know, in the end, will be the difference between a major work and something which is a copy. I think there are physical traces always. I'm very big, as you can tell, on biology, the body, physicality. And because what we often forget is you may lose your sense of touch. You may lose the use of a limb. You may even, you know, have other lacks, but those parts of the brain that are responsible for those feelings are still there. When they are not there, that's problematic. So when you have lesions to the brain, you know, as we know, if you have lesions to the amygdala, you're not going to be frightened by the sight of a snake, either in a picture or in reality. But if you have your limbs, but you know, the cortical correlates of your limbs, you're still fine from the point of view of perception, physical perception.
Thank you. Now we will have Professor Alan from the School of Creative Media.
Thank you for the talk. I have two questions. One is about empathy and one is about mirror neurons. The question about empathy is, we normally think of empathy in, well, maybe define it in two ways. One is if we understand the thoughts, feelings, and experiences of another. And another way is that we actually share the feeling of another, as opposed to sympathy. And often the two are connected, so that we have this capacity to share the feelings of another because we have the capacity to imaginatively understand the point of view of another. And so my question is, what's your definition of empathy? Because you seem to be reducing empathy to an activity of imitation, and an activity of imitation doesn't seem to involve the imagination at all. I mean, if one thinks of emotional contagion, for example, there we have an imitative activity, but we can't think of emotional contagion as being empathy in any way. It's just simply when when somebody copies and picks up, catches the emotion of someone else and imitates it. So my question is, I'm not clear about, I guess my question is I'm not clear about what you mean by empathy, or if you mean by empathy imitation, how that's empathy. That's my first question. The second question has to do with—
Can I answer your first question first?
Sure.
Or is it? Yeah. So, I mean, this is a very interesting question, and I'm going to answer you, I hope, precisely. And I've had arguments about this, and I'm in a minority here so far. But obviously, you know, one likes to think of oneself as potentially a visionary, and one likes to think of oneself as being right in the end. But it's my view of empathy has to do with imitation, but it is not. There is no. I'm not making any equivalence between empathy and imitation. My view of empathy is that empathy is a shared motor response or a shared physical response, nothing more and nothing less. Because I think your definition of empathy, which is a common one, is actually much more like sympathy. In other words, you know, when someone tells me a story about their sad life, I'm sitting next to the person on the plane, right? And they tell me their sad story, you know, they lost a family member, they failed their exam, whatever. And our sympathy is aroused because we have some sense, you would say imaginative sense, but I would just say some sense of what emotions those persons have been through on the basis of our personal experience. We may be more or less sensitive people. I don't call that empathy at all. I once had a furious argument with Mark Solms about this, who is a famous neuropsychiatrist. And he says, no, empathy has to do with listening carefully and identifying, you know, with that person on the basis of your own understanding of their plight. I want to keep it to a purely physical and purely motoric engagement with the suffering of another. I want to do this because I think empathy has become too broad a term. It's, most people disapprove of the term now. I mean, Paul Bloom, who was a big expert on empathy, wrote a book called Against Empathy. And Benjamin himself, Walter Benjamin, hated empathy because he also thought this was a bourgeois concept of all the things he didn't like, he reduced to bourgeois concepts. It was a bit subtler than that. But he hated empathy because he thought that we could never bring those, it's easy enough for us to put us in their place, but they can't put themselves in our place. That was his objection. And so people use empathy for all kinds of reasons that have to do with the understanding of the pain of others. And why I like that painting that I showed you, Roger van Weyden, which is about the compassio, the co-suffering. When I talk about co-suffering, I mean that your body is impacted in a way that is akin to the suffering of the other. That's empathy for me. So I'm excluding all this other soppy, sentimental, emotional co-feeling.
Okay. My second question is about mirror neurons, which is the fact that if we are, I mean, maybe not on your definition of empathy, but on many people's understanding of empathy, partly or what I would call the
orthodox, the
orthodox understanding of empathy. What's distinctive about empathy is that our capacity is the empathic person, is the capacity to understand emotional situations that most of us can't. And that if we think of somebody with greater empathy, they have this power to place themselves in situations that are novel and unfamiliar. Now, the problem with the mirror neuron theory is that it doesn't allow us to explain how we can understand novel and unfamiliar forms of emotional experience, because it's based upon the idea that the macaque monkey or the human brain replicates the situation in their own case, that is the situation when they perceive the case of another. But this means that we must already have had the experience, the pathway, in order to recognize immediately the situation of another and emotionally respond to it. But what about the case of novel experiences and novel situations, which surely is the domain of art as well, to explore and express? How can mirror neurons actually explain our response to those novel situations which artists constantly present us with?
So, I obviously use mirror theory and, the fact of mirror neuron firing as an element in my understanding of empathy. But I haven't gone as far as to say that mirror neurons are constitutive of empathy. I don't think they are.
A lot of people do claim that.
They do, absolutely.
Yes.
I do, and I would actually, I've written a small paragraph about that long time ago, about saying that there may be a help one to understand, but they're certainly not essential to the understanding of the plight of others. I'm using, as you will have gathered, mirror neuron theory to give an account of the ways in which they offer for me an example of responses that are prior to cognition. That's what interests me about mirror neurons. And that's not anything to do with my discussion of empathy. It's got to do with my understanding actually of works of art. So those people who say mirror neurons are essential for empathy, I wouldn't go as far as to say that.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I basically agree with your position on this combining of mirror neuron theory with empathy. And I can also see that I have to be careful sometimes because I may give that impression. But you're right. I mean, I don't think mirror neurons have nothing to do with novel experiences. And I agree that Well, they do have, you see, if these experiences are involved in any kind of physical reaction, many kinds of physical reaction, I mean, the original mirror theorist said it had to be goal-directed actions, but many kinds of, immediate responses are, in fact, mirror responses, and they provide us with a first step in access to understanding, but it doesn't constitute understanding of others at all. But we could go on talking about this forever. We're closer on the second question than on the first.
Thanks. Do anyone would like to raise further questions to Professor Freedberg? Or David, do you have anything to add?
There is a question there. There is a question. Somebody's got their hand up.
Okay.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me? This is Yifang.
Yes, I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Hi.
Oh, great. Okay, Yifang. Okay, yeah, I see you. Hi.
Yeah. So my name is Yifang from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. I'm actually assisting a professor, Andrea Nanetti, in some digital humanities projects at the moment. I find the talk quite fascinating, actually. So thank you for that. And I do have a question related to the example that you provided in the talk. So you actually give a lot of examples of realistic paintings or sculptures, or even for the column, the Roman column itself is relatively a recognizable form. But I'm just wondering whether there are studies related to like abstract paintings or abstract art that has just colors or lines or dots in it, and whether they would also, whether people or audiences seeing them will also have a similar feeling or reactions, and whether these feelings or reactions are similar among different audiences or they're actually different. Yeah, so I'm just wondering whether you have any views on this.
Okay, so I'm going to show you, if the audience, I'm just going to show you.
I saw some Jackson Pollock. I mean, if I'm not wrong, there seems to be a Jackson Pollock in.
There was a Jackson. I'm going to start briefly with a Jackson Pollock, and then I'll just say two things, and then you ask two questions. Remember the second question, because I want to clarify that too, but I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to find my images, if you don't mind. Wait, share. And I'm going to, okay. So here, I'm just going to briefly go through some theories I've had. I'm not going to, I just share some theories I had. I've always felt that these swirly paintings of Jackson Pollock involve you in a sense of movement, and I think this should be tested, and often the movement is directional. I have the great idea by Zhao Mengfu, you can see here, 1310, amazing image. I think some people at Hong Kong many years ago did experiments which showed activation both of premotor cortex and the activation of hand muscles in looking at examples of Chinese calligraphy. What interested me years later was Kejia did these characters with a flashlight, you can see, with both his hands. So it's so interesting to think of this as these characters which involve you in it, but it's actually done by somebody behind. So you get a sense of the movement by looking, but you also see the guy behind doing it. But to get to your question, the last question, so we did an experiment with these paintings of Lucio Fontana, these slashes in a canvas, and what we found, this relates to empathy, but it's got nothing to do with empathy, to get back to the previous gentleman's question. But what we found was that in looking at these, we had a totally different EEG reaction to the slashes of the paintings in the de Kooning and the digital reproductions of these. I wish I could show you them, which showed a lower a higher EEG response. In other words, when you have a feeling of movement, the EEG responses are actually lower. and the mu rhythms are actually lower. And so here, in this case, there was an enhanced motor response in the finger muscles of the viewers than a purely digital equivalent of these. So I don't know what you want to make of this. What was your name again who asked this question? And this probably was because you see that these, talking of skills and manuality, Astrid, when you do these slashes, you can see that de Kooning did these slashes, they widened, you could actually have a sense of the manuality of it. When you had a pure digital reproduction of these, we did them without this swelling scene, not just a photographic reproduction. And the mu rhythms were enhanced, which means that there was a lower brainwave level when you were looking at the digital reproductions. So I think, you know, with the abstract imagery, there's a lot of work to be done. Your second question, I remember now, whether we did it with, we have not done, I always say this is the Polynesia, New Guinea question. In other words, most of our experiments have been done with people from the same, more or less the same culture. I mean, up in Colombia, I've done with, you know, African Americans, people of different educational backgrounds, and it hasn't affected our results, especially one way or the other. And I don't think they would, even if we were to have subjects from Papua New Guinea. But I think the whole area of abstract painting really requires, I'd love to do some work on with EEG's electroencephalograms and responses to paintings Jackson Pollock. Oh, here, you know, with there are lots of things which can be done. I mean, this is a painting by Richard Serra, and I'm sure that you would find some kind of tactile response to a form like this, both a motor and a tactile response to a form like this, because these, you know, have all these hairy bits and so on that you kind of want to wipe away. So I don't think, again, the difference would be great in one culture or another culture, between one culture and another. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Okay, thank you, Prof.
I mean, you know, this will arouse much skepticism, but I'm glad. Thank you for giving me opportunity to add this to the end.
Yeah. So I would just like to say again, thanks for David. I think reschedule is the 11:20 as the end of this lecture. And I was wondering, either you have any remarks to make, or other colleagues would like to add anything. If not, I think we just want to say a thanks again for David for the fascinating discussions, and actually in this particular workshop, this advanced school, we have researcher from M+ Museum in Hong Kong to share of their latest research on how they preserve and arts and things like that. And so people are most welcome to attend. And of course, if you have further questions, most welcome to read David's books and or send him an email. So, and we hope we are counting on the second or third lectures that you're going to give us either here or elsewhere. So
Okay.
yeah. So thanks a lot for attending, and have a good evening. Yeah, and also
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to talking to you. I enjoyed the questions. I look forward to hearing from those of you who have any further ones. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Good luck. Bye-bye.